Okay, hi everyone, welcome back. And in this update, we are going to check out Zebec's price chart. And I think in the short term, I'm able to identify some optimistic signs. But before we get into technicals, first things first, we are going to talk about some very important things. And in case you are active on Twitter, I would like to suggest to definitely give Zebec a follow because every now and then they actually talk about some seriously important stuff. Now, in this clip, Simon, the Zebec CEO, basically explains why ISO 222 upgrade is one of the most important steps in Zebec's entire roadmap. And it's very important to understand that ISO 222, it's not really like a small update. No, it's actually more like a final switch that turns Zebec from a crypto project into a real financial technology platform that big companies, again, this is really the keyword, big companies can actually use. Trust me, this is like that much of a big deal. And Simon in this clip highlights three very important points that show how serious this upgrade actually is and just how much it actually matters for Zebec. So let's talk about these three important points. And first things first, Simon says that ISO 222 has become basically non-negotiable for their biggest clients, and that actually tells you exactly who Zebec is building for. They are building for large banks, global companies, and major institutions that cannot simply touch anything unless it follows international standards. And if Zebec wasn't ISO already, believe me when I tell you that these clients simply wouldn't really adopt it. But with this certification, I think the biggest adoption barrier actually is going to disappear, which I think they are going to achieve ISO 222 by the end of the year, which is awesome. Now, second important point, Simon calls this a step change and compares it to what FedNow did for the Federal Reserve. You see, ISO 222 isn't really just a file format. No, it completely actually changes how payments data moves. And instead of, for instance, messaging, I don't know, let's say client A paid client B this much, ISO actually allows detailed metadata to move with the payment. We are talking about things, for example, like invoice numbers, tax fields, and also payment purpose. And this makes it like much easier for businesses to automate compliance and accounting. And that's exactly why major institutions wouldn't really adopt you if you are not ISO 222 compliant. Okay, it's very important to understand that. And finally, the last point, Simon talks about how difficult the process actually has been. In this clip, he says that this whole process actually took them months and months of upgrading old systems, rebuilding internal processes, and also doing full data mapping. And to me, this actually shows two very important things. Number one is just how serious Zebec actually is about building real financial rails. And number two, how hard is it for competitors to actually catch up? You see, most crypto projects actually completely avoid all these types of upgrades because they require real infrastructure. But on the other hand, Zebec in here is doing the work that others are not really able, or let's say they don't really want to do. And I do think because of this in the future, we are going to see a lot of adoption coming towards Zebec's way. Now, let's also talk a little bit about the second part of the story, which is Zebec teaming up with NatPay. And we actually talked about this specific announcement. I think it was like 2-3 videos back, and we talked about just how important this is. And if ISO 222 is really the key, okay, NatPay in here is the engine that makes the whole system actually move money in the real world. You see, NatPay has been operating since the early 90s and has processed over 180 billion a year for hundreds of thousands of clients. So when Zebec connects to NatPay, okay, you should know that they are essentially plugging straight into a payments network that already handles massive volumes. And this, in my view, gives Zebec direct exposure to real businesses and real payroll flows instead of just depending on only and only Web3 users. Also, in my opinion, this partnership between Zebec and NatPay actually creates a bit of a hybrid system where, for example, companies can choose to send payments through traditional ACH rails or maybe through stable coins on Zebec. And this flexibility, in my view, is a bit of a game changer for ZBCN because it lets old school companies experiment with blockchain payments without really throwing away their existing system, which is really not ideal. And this is essentially like letting them test the future while still at the same time keeping one foot in the present, which is really nice. Now, another very important detail to note in here is actually NatPay's connection to FedNow, which, in case you don't know, FedNow is essentially the US Federal Reserve's instant payment network. You see, by building through NatPay, Zebec in here actually becomes one of the rare few crypto native platforms with indirect access to real-time fiat settlement. And this, I do think that opens the doors to true instant conversion between fiat and stablecoins, which is really the kind of capability that big companies actually care about and wanted from you. Now, if you are wondering, well, okay, why is this necessarily bullish for ZBCN itself? Well, okay, you see, when you put everything together, the direction actually becomes clear because ISO 222 certification actually removes the compliance risk that usually scares large institutions away, and it fully puts Zebec in the same standards category as major financial networks like, for example, Swift and JP Morgan. The NatPay integration, on the other hand, actually brings real users, and we are talking about, for instance, maybe businesses, payroll systems, and also employees onto Zebec's rails, and even let's say like a very small fraction of NatPay's yearly flow moves through Zebec to take advantage of faster settlement or maybe lower fees. Well, okay, I think it is very much safe to say that the increase in network activity can be very significant, and it is exactly those types of volumes that strengthen the overall utility of the platform and can also increase long-term demand for ZBCN token itself. And in a world where regulations are tightening, well, okay, platforms that aren't really ISO compliant, I think may not necessarily survive. And it's very important to understand that Zebec is actually securing a place in the next generation of payment infrastructure, not only in the crypto market itself, but also the broader financial system. And that is exactly one very important reason to be bullish on Zebec. You see, in the bear market, I actually care about the projects that just constantly are able to bring revenue. And the only way I would say pretty much to achieve that is actually by having a business outside of the crypto market. Because when there is no hype and not a lot of people are paying attention to the market, then okay, your chain is not really going to be active, right? That's why your revenue as a blockchain is probably going to go down. However, when it comes to Zebec, okay, the story is way different. They are working on the payroll side, and it's again very important to understand payroll is like an extremely sticky business. Once a company adopts you, as long as not a whole lot is going to go wrong, they are going to just simply stick with you, and they don't really care about the crypto market, whether you are in a bear market or maybe a bull market. One way or the other, you are going to have constant revenue, which again is a very important reason to be bullish on Zebec. So overall, I think fundamental wise, we are absolutely 100% on the right track. And I do think in the future, a lot more people are going to be familiar with Zebec because let's be honest, right now, I think we are somewhere around rank 150th. And very few people actually understand what Zebec is doing. Why do I say very few people actually know Zebec? Because if a lot of people were aware of Zebec, the price wouldn't really be around these areas. I think we would have been like easily top 50. And right now, since we're not, okay, makes perfect sense to argue if you believe in the fundamental of Zebec, maybe right around these areas is actually a decent buy opportunity. That's why as we go lower and lower in Zebec, I'm just going to buy the dip one by one. in order to get my average purchase as low as possible. Right now, I think it's somewhere around, let's say, 0.3 of a cent, which you might say, well, okay, it's not really ideal, but again, I'm just trying. And if we end up having maybe like one more move on the downside in order to take the loss and maybe even go to around these areas, trust me, at that point I am going to buy a whole lot of Zebec and my average purchase is going to drop almost instantly. But the question is, are we actually going to get a move down or not? Well, in a very short time, I think I'm able to identify some optimistic signs. However, whether we are going to go according to the bullish case or not, that can be, I guess, up for debate. Now, let's go on H1 time frame. You see, the last time that we talked about Zebec, I think we were right around these areas, and the idea was that, well, okay, we may see a bit of a bounce, but that bounce might be a correction structure, and then you may end up having like one more move on the downside. And if we get this thing, it could be a decent long opportunity. And I would say also, for those of you who are like me and your average purchase is actually around these highs, it can also be a buy opportunity for the mid to long term as well. Why is that though? You see, in terms of Elios waves, if you want to argue that we're going to have our final low around here, maybe this is like a very important support, then okay, you have to be able to find off of the lows a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 wave on the upside. And in Zebec, I do think that we are actually having a bit of a 5 wave. And if I just zoom a bit more, there we go. You see, in my view, this can absolutely be 1, 2, 3 correction for another move up into wave 5, followed by that. I do think so far we are actually on track to have a correction structure in here, and the question is, can we even argue maybe we are lucky and our correction has come to an end? The answer is yes, and here is how I can argue that. You see, I'm thinking you should probably consider the possibility of having maybe an A, B, C in form of a zigzag, and for our sub waves, you know it. We're gonna have 5 down into A. Excuse me, what just happened? There we go. Correction for wave B, maybe ABC, maybe WXY. Doesn't really matter, honestly. And then another 5 down into C. Now let's go on the live chart. So, in this initial move on the downside, I do think you are able to maybe sort of kind of argue that this is like a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, followed by a correction up. And since no, let's actually argue that this is like a WXY in form of a double zigzag, and this can very well be yet another 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 wave down. So if you insist on calling this thing our final low, I guess you can say maybe this is like an ABC zigzag. And pay attention, this isn't really my base case, since in Zebec, if you want to say this is our wave C, well, okay, in it, as you can see, by like a very small margin, we did not take this important low of our wave A. And do not get me wrong, having something like this is absolutely possible, and in this case we call this thing a truncated wave C. But here's the thing, truncated waves are actually quite rare, so I don't really think we should consider this as our base case. Now, my primary scenario, I think, does suggest maybe this is a 5 wave down, like do not get it twisted, but on a higher degree into a wave 1, correction for wave 2, and then we can have like another move down into wave 3, 4, 5, and I don't really believe this is going to be like that much of an insane move on the downside. It's just going to be a bit of a chopping around, and at that point, I do think the subwaves, hopefully for an ABC zigzag, are going to be complete, and then what you want to see is a strong bounce in form of a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 in order to take the height of our B leg. Now, if from the current point we start going up in like a very strong and sharp manner in form of, you know it, a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 in order to take the highs, okay, that can be potentially a bit of a different story, and I guess maybe like a very much optimistic sign indicating hopefully we have hit the lows in Zebec. But as long as we are not having this move, I think we need to be just a little bit more patient and careful and see what are we going to do in here. Are we going to, in the very short term, go under this level, which could potentially translate to yet another move on the downside? Or maybe from here, we are going to immediately witness like a very strong bounce. One way or the other, here is my message. I think in Zebec we are actually looking bullish, and even if like in the short term we end up having one more move down, it's not really going to be that much of like a pessimistic sign. Okay, it's very important to understand, because I do think there's like a very high chance on a higher degree. This is one, this is two, and what's next? You know it. Great move up into wave 3, 4, 5. And once we go above this important line, a lot of people are going to call this thing a beautiful head and shoulder structure, which the target for it, I think we actually measured it in the previous videos, is somewhere around half a cent area. Essentially, you can expect maybe after breaking the neckline, something like a 60-70% move on the upside in like very short term. But I don't really believe that we are going to stop there. I think we are going to probably go quite a bit higher than that. So as you can see, one way or the other, I do think we are actually looking great. And as long as we are holding this important area, we shouldn't, in my view, be worried at all. And I hope I explained everything well and you understood what is going on in Zebec's price chart. Anyway, if you found any value in my content, I would really appreciate if you like this video and consider subscribing to my channel and follow me on Twitter. And if you want more, maybe you want a complete analysis for your own specific crypto, or maybe you want to learn some decent TA in order to be able to make good money in the markets, you can become a member and ask me anything what. And until the next update, I hope you have a wonderful time. Goodbye.